Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote as we present our Gibson's Bookstore event calendar virtually through Zoom as we are all stuck at home. So we have the three of us here and we are tonight joined by Jessica Anthony. Which side of the screen am I on? Jessica Anthony and a Gibson's own Hillary Nelson, and they are here this evening to discuss Jess's book, Enter the Aardvark. We are very pleased to have them here tonight. The book is for sale from Gibson's Bookstore. Our event program is sustained by book sales and donations. We would be thrilled if you purchase a book from us this evening. We do have signed bookplates that we can include in with the book since it's so hard to get a signed book right now. But on that note, Jess, Hillary, take it away. Tell us about Enter the Aardvark.
How do you want to begin, Jess? Do you want to do your little description and reading?
Sure. So, hi everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. Enter the Aardvark is about a GOP millennial congressman who is running for re-election, and he receives one day on his doorstep a gigantic taxidermic aardvark that within the space of about 24 hours ends up bringing down his entire re-election campaign. The novel goes back and forth between the present day story of Alex Wilson, our congressman, and also follows the aardvark back in 1875, right after it was hunted in Namibia, and the carcass is sent to England and is stuffed by Titus Downing, a taxidermist in England. And so the novel really, two parallel stories emerge in the telling of the novel. The story of Alex Wilson and his downfall through the revelation of his secret lover, Greg Tampico, and also the story of a parallel love affair that is happening between Titus Downing, the taxidermist, and the hunter of the aardvark, Richard Oslet. I guess that's about enough of a summary that I want to give for right now, but I thought I would actually start tonight just by reading the opening of the novel, which I've really only read one other time so far with these online events. So if you guys can bear with me through the sort of wild few opening pages of the novel, which then lead us into the opening section of the present day with Alex Wilson. I'm also going to ask everybody to hang on for just 1 second because my dog is stuck in the office and is whining. Well, so if everyone can just wait for 1 second so I can gain my focus. Okay, thank you.
Like to show us your dog?
Come on, out you go. Go on, out you go. Go on, out. Oh, thank you. So sorry. somehow the dog got trapped, as it happens. Yes. So at any rate, the opening of the novel is a little bit unhinged, and literally and figuratively. It's about 3 pages of some wild prose, and then things calm down a little bit when we enter the opening chapter with Alex Wilson. So here we go. Enter the Aardvark. A whirling mass of vapors is unhinged, shooting through outer space for an infinity until it collides with an ellipsis which does not let go. And after another infinity, the vapors boil into fire clouds trapped by gravity, turning and returning until the boiling clouds, accepting fate, cool into a single mantle which cracks open in places. And here comes the lava expanding. But there are also places where the expanding lava cannot escape. And so the lava, pushes itself against itself, and ta-da, mountains. New vapor rises up through the surface of the mantle, hitting the air, and it is all at once water, big water, and this big water hits the hot lava, steam shoots up, pluming, and it's these watery plumes rising and falling ad nauseum that birth the oceans, and within the oceans are vast trenches paralleled by islands, which are cool rock formations from the hot lava varietals sludging obscenely over the mantle, itself now a whole globe of unmappable gray wacky and chert, and the sun shines upon these waters until in the shallowest banks, atolls and shelves, tumbling in the warm current. Here come the flagellates, the plankton and phytoplankton, all tense and numerous, ticking and rolling the floor bottom, which is coated in algae and lamp shells and pouchy glass sponges, until here come the copepods, krill and medusae, the crab larvae, the pteropods, salps and heteropods, and the worms. My God, the arrowworms. Something must be done about the freaking arrowworms. So enter the squirrelfish, enter the mantis shrimp, the flat lantern hatchetfish, enter the miniature squid, and some grow tails and all have shells and mouths. They swallow everything, fattening into fish, and these plumpy fish grow long, swimmy. They shake the oceans into a state, and some of these fish hanging out at the edges of some of these pools are bumping their snouts into the earth. They want to dry off, go upland, and lo, here begins the great creep. And will you look at them there, ectothermic tetrapod vertebrates, go. All hail the Devonian nerds, the Tiktaaliks and Tulurpatons tossing back their flat heads, puffing oxygen up through their watery tubes, eventually shedding their gills for skin, for open air, and still another infinity must pass as these miserable vertebrates shalump around the shifting plates until they at last settle the Karoo beds of southern Africa as bent-legged, flared-elbowed reptilians, all mastering the art of double articulation, their planes of movement align. They hasten towards quickening until in their skulls a second bony palate is formed, foreshadowing the near-complete separation of food, of air. These therapsid temporal openings are migrating toward the top of the skull. And here's the sagittal crest, the brain case and rostrum. They are the virgin class mammalia, within which not long after emerges a clade of Afrotherian mini-beasts, litters of sengies and tenrecs, shrews and hyraxes. Their tiny snouts toughen. Soft hides go real thick as the fur thins, showing off the tough hide, which is pinkish yellow in hue, gleaming under the sun. And what's there to eat? There's nothing to eat. We must find something to eat, and so they dig. A hoof appears. But the hoof is lousy at digging. It cleaves thrice and voila. Lose the pollux, enter the claws, each a thick spoon. Enter the ears, long, soft, and tubular. Enter the buccal snout, twice as long as a pig's, half as long as an anteater's, but it is not an anteater's. This particular snout holds 9 olfactory bulbs, best of anybody out there on the grassland, stampeding the hot, bitchy savanna. And after another infinity, through the parallel evolution of a far less sturdy mammal, modern man, one of whom goes by the name Sir Richard Oslet, but what are names? And Sir Richard Oslet assigns to them in 1875, but what is time? The order Edentata, without teeth, before realizing he's wrong. The creature is, in fact, tubulidentata. The teeth are there at the back, by the throat. These dentine tubes, they serve the tongue, which is itself slender, protractile, and covered with a thick, viscous substance to which ants and termites clawed up from the ground will all from here on out helplessly adhere. Enter a Rictoripus into the log, Oslet tells his assistant as he examines the claws. That's from the Greek. Do you know what it means? The young man shakes his head. Digging-footed, says Oslet, with the ears of a rabbit and snout like a pig, but what to call it? He begins pacing. Enter the hare pig. The ears and snout tell us they're guided by hearing and smell. No, wait. Enter the ant bear, he says, but that's still not right. He asks one of the African hunters what they call these beasts. Aardvarka, the hunter says, and the hunter, black and handsome, does not know that his people adopted the word centuries ago from Dutch colonists as he points earth pig. Oslet nods vigorously. Enter the aardvark, he says, which the young assistant, a student of his in the Department of Naturalism at the University of Edinburgh, obediently enters. Chapter 1. It is August. Congress is in recess. You are not in recess. You are running a re-election campaign for the 1st Congressional District in Virginia. Your opponent's name is Nancy Beavers, and you have made up your mind that from here on out there will be no more days off. If you are going to lose your job, it is not going to be to a woman. Not a woman named Nancy. Not a woman named Nancy fucking Beavers. So you had no intention of taking today off, but today there's a heat wave. Grids are out all over the city. Your grid is one of the ones that is out. The AC is not working. The internet is not working. The TV is not working. Nothing is working. You are not working. You are reposed upon a Victorian sofa the color of canaries that your assistant purchased for you 3 days ago at a street antique fair for $1,900, flipping through the book Images of Greatness, an intimate look at the presidency of Ronald Reagan, until you find what you're looking for. A photograph of the Gipper reclined upon a canary yellow velvet Victorian sofa. Important looking papers cross his chest. You have looked at this photograph many times. It is the reason why you purchased this sofa, and now that you have it, you are lying on the exact same sofa in the exact same position as Ronald Wilson Reagan. You turn the page. There is Dutch, the Gipper, on his ranch, riding a horse chased by piebald foxhounds, the paunch of his stomach outlining a lightweight denim cowboy shirt, and you bought that same exact shirt at the exact same antique fair, and how the flaps of his tan riding pants do crest the tops of his riding boots, you think, and consider sending your assistant to return to the fair to seek out those boots when the doorbell rings. Your doorbell is not a buzzer. It's something more ancient, like from the 80s. You wonder who it could be because no one ever comes to your door. Everyone always comes to your office. Then you wonder how the doorbell is working when nothing else is. The doorbell, you realize, is not attached to the grid. This freaks you out. It could be Rutledge or Olioke, you think, the two congressmen who stay with you during the week in the extra rooms of your townhouse near the Capitol while Congress is in session, but that's highly unlikely. Representative William Billy Rutledge, D., is back on his farm with his wife and 5 sons. He left 2 days ago and won't be back till September. Representative Solomon Sammy Olioke, R., is at some cottage with his wife and 5 daughters. Some crappy cottage by some crappy lake, and Olioke leaves his crap everywhere in your townhouse. He's crappy at governing. He's from Rhode Island. He's been reelected 4 times, so even though he's a Republican, you kind of hate Olioke. The doorbell rings again. You have no wife, no children. You, like Representative Rutledge, are young, white, and handsome. However, you are a bachelor. You are fine with this. This was the hallmark of your first campaign, this and abortion. It's how people know you. But now that you are facing re-election, your aides are not fine with this. Your favorability rating is currently holding steady at 52%, which, although good, is not as good as it could be. And as of late, your aides have been telling you to find a wife. If you find a wife, they say, your favorability rating will improve because although you are neck and neck with Nancy fucking Beavers, a middle-aged woman with an ass like 2 neighborly cast iron skillets who wears these unbelievable pantsuits, Nancy fucking Beavers is not fucking single. She has fucking children. Your platform is bachelor and her platform is children, and you are trying to wrap your brain matter around the fact that many people who should constitute your electorate will actually trust Nancy fucking Beavers more than they trust you simply because she has children, roundly discarding the fact that her only experience in government is losing a local mayoral campaign by a hair when the doorbell rings a 3rd time. You go upstairs, you put on your bathrobe. Your bathrobe is navy blue with red piping and costs $398. It is monogrammed APW in chancery on the breast pocket and is Egyptian cotton from Bill Blass, Ronald Reagan's favorite designer. There's a picture of Reagan wearing the bathrobe in Images of Greatness from when he got shot, and you always feel pretty good wearing the bathrobe, which is why, even though it's so hot out, you put on the bathrobe. You wear an Oxford underneath, like Reagan. Even after he got shot, he wore an Oxford underneath. You are less of a man than Ronald Reagan, you know this, but no one will ever be able to say about you that your goals were not lofty, you think, as you return downstairs and open the door. And I'll stop there.
Bravo.
Thanks. Sorry about the chaos, my goodness. That's what happens when you have a GSP in the house, German Short-Hair Pointer.
Oh, I grew up with a German short-haired pointer.
Yeah, awesome.
They're great.
Oh,
I love dogs. Jess, I've said this to you before. I'm just going to say it again. This is one of my favorite books I've read in a very, very long time. It is such a gem. It's not a long book. I'm going to hold it up here. I have lots of notes on it, but it's just this little tiny, 180-page book or something. But it is so precise. The craft is just exquisite in this book. I said to you, if I was still in my MFA program 20 years ago, I would totally write about this book because you bring out every tool in the tool chest to really pull this off. It is just, it's funny, it is touching, it is full of interesting nonfiction. I just can't say enough good things about this book.
thank you so much.
And I'm just so delighted that you could be with us. So thank you for coming. And I'm so sorry that this horrible pandemic came because you're not far from New Hampshire and you were going to come to the store. So
I know. Well, I mean, at least we have this moment.
yeah,
Can do
but
this, you know.
unlucky for you to have this published on the eve of destruction.
Mm.
Um, well, I have a whole list of questions, but people who are listening to this are also really welcome to jump in with their questions. And Elizabeth is going to signal us with an aardvark when someone wants to ask something. But I thought I'd just start with, it's not really a craft question, but I'm sure people would like to know how you came to write this book.
Yeah, sure. I'll often start with titles, to be honest. And the words just Enter the Aardvark appeared in my mind sometime around 2012, so it was a while ago. And if I have, you know, a gathering of words that, you know, that stay with me for whatever reason, that just kind of sit in my mind, and I, you know, I kind of can't forget about them, then I know that something interesting is going on in that gathering of language, and I'm gonna want to try and answer it somehow in story. And so in 2015, in the run up to the 2016 election, I had a sense that I wanted to write some kind of a political novel. I had no idea what it was going to be. And this, you know, these three words, Enter the Aardvark, really came to the front of my consciousness. And so I decided to sit down and chase them. It's what the surrealist poet Andre Breton would call a waking sentence, right? Enter the Aardvark is like an instruction. It's compelling us to take some kind of action. And so I was compelled to try and figure out what this action would be. And there was also some forward movement in Enter the Aardvark. It was like you're walking into, you know, this sort of speed, this darkness that I just felt compelled to know. So I also was thinking about this phrase, a whirling mass of vapors is unhinged, which I'd been reading actually some Gravity's Rainbow at the time, and I was thinking about that great opening passage of screaming comes across the sky. And so a whirling mass of vapors is unhinged, but I guess kind of in my mind is a way to perhaps enter into, you know, the evolution of an aardvark. I didn't really know where it was going to take me. But by the end of those first few pages of the novel, I had an aardvark carcass in South Africa, you know, in 1875. That's where I'd landed. And so from that point, I realized, all right, well, I'm going to be moving back and forth between two time periods. I knew I wanted to tackle a contemporary political story. And I also knew that I'd be moving it, you know, sort of into history. I didn't quite know at the beginning of the novel that I actually would be staying with these same four characters the way that the novel does. I thought I might sort of follow the aardvark a little bit differently, but when I started writing Titus Downing, the taxidermist, I just became so emotionally connected to that character and sort of his spirit that I had to stay with him. And so as I was writing, you know, this rather cretinous villain in contemporary DC, this, you know, I mean, but, you know, blind in almost in certainly in some empathic ways as well, you know, a character at the mercy of his own politics. I had this counterpoint, which was a much more kind of earnest, easier to like fellow who really was solipsistic in a similar way to Alex, but had his own distinct qualities that made him, in my mind at least, somewhat of a better person. Probably largely just due to his circumstance, but yeah. So that's how the beginning of the book started to take shape. Yeah.
Yeah, this character of Titus Downing, it's interesting that you said that. I think I mentioned to you, he really, your descriptions of him are just these wonderful renderings of an artist. And I was so struck as I was reading it that he has this one moment where he says, to understand how a creature moves, or he's thinking, to understand how a creature moves, you have to know what a creature wants. And I thought, that's a writer. A writer does that very same thing. Do you, you know, you just said that you felt like you had that kind of a connection to him, that he
Sure.
very much is like you creating this book.
Well, I'm always interested in the commonalities between different genres of artists. There are all kinds of parallels between choreographers and painters and writers. And so when I was thinking about, really how Titus himself would have viewed his own profession, in my mind, he had an enormous amount of integrity for this work of trying to accurately recreate a creature he'd never seen before. And in many ways, of course, that's like a story, because we don't know the story that we're writing until it's written. And so it requires a leap of faith. You really have to believe in, the sort of the potential of your own imagination before you even know what it can deliver, right? You sort of have to have faith in the process of the thing, and you have to understand, in very nuanced ways, the rewards and the downfalls of the process as you go. And so if you're going to make this a literal thing in the stuffing of the stuffing of an aardvark in 1875, you have to know what his tools are and what his shop is and what elements of the trade he's mastered so far, in his craft. All of that, I totally agree, are parallels to any art form, for sure.
And he has to edit the aardvark. He puts it together, and he realizes it's not right, and he has to take it all apart again.
Well, and without offering any huge plot spoilers, I mean, some of the choices he makes in the final product, he allows himself his own whimsy with the aardvark. It becomes, literally like a surrealist beast. The final product is extremely unnerving. The aardvark really looks nothing like an aardvark. I will say no more, other than its basic, atmosphere. To look at the expression of the aardvark as he makes it is a very unsettling thing. Yeah, I don't want to say too much.
No, that's a key part of the story. Is
hey, I like that.
Okay, I see an aardvark.
So I'm just going to take this moment to mention that Enter the Aardvark is available from Gibson's Bookstore, and our events program is sustained by book sales. If you would like to purchase the book from Gibson's Bookstore, I'm throwing a link into the chat bar and into the description, and carry on.
I wondered if you could talk a bit about the structure of this book. It's very binary in a lot of ways. There are the parallel two people in the present and the two people in the past. Mm-hmm. You switch rapidly back and forth between these two time periods. There's a lot of mirroring that happens in the book. A thing will happen in the present that also happens in the past. Words are repeated. It has this remarkable layering effect that happens. Could you talk about how why and how you came up with this structure?
I love that question. Thank you. Well, there are no accidents in fiction. I believe that to be so. And so, I think if you're writing from two different time periods, there are going to be questions that emerge that these narratives begin to ask each other. And, I really had no plan or order in mind for the various revelations of plot or the overlaps, the mirroring that occurs in these two stories. They really happened organically as I was writing. I wrote the first draft very quickly in about 6 weeks.
Wow.
I guess I'm going to be a little bit heady here and mention actually Sigmund Freud, who talks about the nature of dreams and how there's a process he called condensation, where the dream can only really occur when you have all of these disparate elements of experience that are filtered into memory. And so, you can have a number of different memories occurring in the same moment to create one cohesive dream. And there's something true, it seems to me, about fiction in that way. John Updike famously said that all stories are born of two unrelated events coming together. And so there's something in the tension between these two narratives that I just found hugely compelling as I was writing. And eventually I started to realize that the past was operating as a kind of echo of the present narrative. I view these characters as very distinct individuals. They are not the same story, but they're speaking to one another. You know, you mentioned earlier when we were talking before we went online today, Hillary, about the question of evolution in the novel. And, you know, when you're thinking about the nature of evolution, as we open in this novel with the evolution of the aardvark, evolution to me doesn't mean that we're getting better. It simply means that we are adapting to whatever environment that we're in, right? Evolution is response. And so I'm, you know, in thinking about the condition of, you know, what a repressed homosexual relationship was or would have been potentially, even in a hyperbolized form in 1875. A lot of those same pressures are upon Alex Wilson today. It's what makes him, in my mind, you know, it allows the reader to have a scrap of empathy for this character who really is at the victim of his own politics and is just beginning to be at the place where he can break out of his lack of self-awareness and begin to see the way that he actually is, you know, needs to participate in society. You know, the blinders this guy has on in the, you know, they're extraordinary. I mean, what he is electing not to see simply because it's inconvenient to him, I found hugely compelling and frankly true in a number of, you know, stories of politicians who, you know, operate hypocritically in office to the detriment of the rest of us. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I was fascinated by your choice of professions for these two characters. I think I was under the misapprehension that you had come up with Alex Wilson first, but it seems like you maybe came up with Titus Downing first. Is that?
Well, I knew that I would be writing, you know, a contemporary politician. You know, right even as I was thinking about the title Enter the Aardvark. And so Alex Wilson, you know, he was definitely in my consciousness first, but Titus Downing is the character who really insisted upon himself, right? In a way that I was kind of investigating Alex, you know, that second person that I'm using to write Alex. I mean, this is a very kind of murky space. I was really like prodding at this character as I was writing him, trying to basically ask him, who are you? What are you about? But, you know, Titus Downing really, he just gripped me emotionally from the very beginning of the novel and wouldn't let go. So they came to me in very different ways, and I sat with them, you know, very differently as I was writing them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. They just both seem sort of the sort of epitomes of their era, you know, that that the huge presence in Victorian England is Charles Darwin.
Sure.
And so he is, I think I said to you that Downing is to Darwin as Wilson is to Trump, you know, that they're sort of the B version of, you know, these huge forces in life.
Well, I think that's really intuitive, and you know, Downing was sort of doing the thing that was in vogue, you know, in Victorian England. I mean, in 1851, there was this great exhibition in Hyde Park in London where all the taxidermists came together and they showed off all of their, you know, their creatures. Taxidermy was kind of like this huge popular movement in England in the Victorian era. I mean, it was the Victorians were quite macabre. I'm not sure if many people realize this, but you know, it really was you know, a passion, right, for this culture. And so just in the way that Titus Downing was a product of that environment, so is Alex Wilson. I mean, he is very much responding to the sort of fast-paced, media-obsessed, wealth-obsessed, you know, young contemporary politician who is really going to do absolutely anything in the world he can to please Mitch McConnell, right, on that side of the aisle. No matter, you know, and so he's willing to toe party line. He's willing to repress his own desires for the sake of the party, which is the real tragedy of this character, it seems to me. But yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's the first half of the book. You feel like he's just, reprehensible in the most hilarious way. But I have to say, I was so moved by where he winds up.
Yeah.
It's lovely and a little kind of heartbreaking. Are you? Oh, Aardvark.
Aardvark.
We do have a question here from Camille. Jess, did you write the arc for each character fully before moving on to the next, or did you go back and forth between Downing and Wilson during the first draft?
Love it, Camille. And hello, I know Camille. Yeah, Camille, I bounced back and forth as I was writing. I had no plan at all. I never planned fiction. I just allowed whatever made sense to come next in the plot, whatever was logical and truly born out of these characters' desires, to simply occur. I was a little worried as I was writing that things were getting kind of out of control. I'm not gonna lie. The novel is one tremendous escalation. Things just keep getting worse for Alex Wilson. It just keeps snowballing on him. And, there was a part of me that was slightly concerned about whether or not I could, arm wrestle it. But there was a reason that escalation occurred. And sure enough, it worked out. It made sense. I think a number of us, I think, who were joining us tonight are writers. And I think this is something that took me a little bit of time to learn how to do. And that's you really have to trust yourself as you're writing these early drafts, that this initial instinct and this initial vision that you're speaking to is doing something, even if you don't fully understand it while you're writing. You can really have faith in it and know that if you simply follow the logic of the plot, this true desire that's kind of bubbling in a subterranean way under the story, it's going to reveal itself to you at some point. You may have even written a complete first draft and you still don't know what it is that you've really done. But I would just say to have faith in it. You really can over-plot or over-organize a fiction, it seems to me. And then, the energy sort of dies, doesn't it? Because you kind of know, what it is that what you're trying to do. You're just sort of filling in blanks at that point, right? In novel writing, you do have to do a little bit of planning, of course. You do have to have a little, some sense of the structure, but I wouldn't try to answer anything too deeply as you're writing. John Irving, I think, of all people, would famously start with the last sentence of his novels, and he would just write towards the last sentence. And so part of this faith too, Camille, comes out of you starting to learn how to, organize for yourself in your own mind what this process is, where you kind of give yourself enough room to have this kind of the faith that you need to create the energy that the story is going to demand from you, right? Because the last thing you want to do, and I see this all the time when I'm teaching fiction, if you plan out the fiction too much, right, you're just kind of filling in what the story is, which means you're not writing out of emotion. You're not feeling your characters. You're kind of doing something that's an intellectual exercise rather than rendering, a deeply felt experience, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That kind of, one of the questions I have for you is, are you, writers will often, say, well, I'm a character-driven writer, I'm a plot-driven writer. And it feels to me like you start with character. Is that true?
Well, in some ways, I think this is a false choice, as because we do this to ourselves, don't we? We say, yeah. What are you? Are you this or that? And, granted, when I was younger, I was sort of taught that question. And so I resisted plot. I said, plot is for John Grisham. Plot is for genre writers. But it's so not true, it seems to me. And when I think about, my favorite novelists, they're always telling me a story that has a marvelously intricate and compelling plot. I've become much more interested in momentum as a writer.
Yes,
I
yes.
really want a novel to make me want to turn the page. But I also don't want to sacrifice language, and I don't want to sacrifice complexity of characters. So I believe that, these questions about character and plot should be deeply interwoven. A character, as soon as they appear on the page, inevitably has to go somewhere or do something or think something. So that's plot. I mean, something's going on, something's moving, something's happening. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of an evasive way of answering that question, Hillary, which is a great question. But I would just say, for me personally, they're very, very closely linked. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one reason I started to ask you that question is because I feel like you are really, really good at using a few strokes to make the reader feel like they know a character, and then you flip it later on. And the example I used is Rebecca Oslet, who is Sir Richard's wife, has these 3 Irish setters named after the Bronte sisters.
Yeah.
And you think you know everything about her because she has these silly Bronte sister named dogs. And then you discover things about those dogs, and those dogs play a part in the plot that just flips everything on its head. And you just do that beautifully. So I don't know where I was going with that, except to just be all fangirl one more time.
That's okay.
You know what I wanted to ask you about is the narrative voice.
Mm-hmm.
You use the second person for the sections that are about Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I thought, okay, well, we're right in his head. And, it's his sort of colloquialism. He's always saying like, or thinking like. And then you realize after a while that this is an omniscient second person narrator.
Yeah, right.
What a trick that was. I just love that.
Thank
so
you.
Tell me about, where did that voice come from?
Well, it's funny. I had no clue that I was going to be writing in the second person at all. I mean, I've never really written in the second person before. I've certainly read just a couple of examples of the second person in fiction. It is very rarely done.
Yep.
And so when I started writing the novel, I actually started writing Alex Wilson in first person, but I immediately was turned off by the point of view choice. It just felt like I didn't want to be reporting this guy's interior that way, for a novel. I just didn't want to be in the eye with him. I couldn't really orient myself. I couldn't really see him in the eye. But I started messing around a little bit with point of view. I think point of view is actually one of the most important choices that you make when you're writing a novel. And sometimes, you can write 80 pages and then realize you're in the wrong point of view, and oh, what a fun moment that is. But yeah, I just started messing around with the second person, and it just clicked. It just made sense to me. It was logical, which shocked me. I have to be totally upfront and say I was just as surprised. I mean, I couldn't believe, there was a moment when I actually asked myself, Anthony, are you really going to do this? Are you really going to write second person? But yeah, I mean, it just felt right. And I'm a writer who really trusts that kind of gut instinct. And so I just allowed myself to go. And as soon as I knew I'd written this one sentence, no one knows that you suck right Tampa goes cock. As soon as that sentence was written, then I knew that I had something that was pretty great. Because there was so much energy and voice in that sentence for me. It meant so many different things to me. It was like its vulgarity interested me. It's sort of accusatory, like that accusatory edge that it carried was interesting to me. And sure enough, the questions that are, in a kind of background way beginning to be asked in that sentence are answered by the end of the novel, like where that anger is coming from. And it really, of course, it's coming from the women in the novel, right? I don't know if we want to go there yet, but I know that we were going to talk about the women in the novel. I mean,
yeah, let's.
Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of speaking about this book a little bit as a feminist cri de coeur. I mean, a way of, putting some pressure upon these fellows who are allowed space, these men who are allowed space in our government to fail and to self-discover at our expense. And that question really, it began to boil as I reached the end of the novel. And so that in a final moment of the book, again, without revealing too much, I mean, Alex is confronted. He's confronted with this consequence of what he's really been doing by the people who have been directly affected by his policies that he is very blindly voting for without thinking twice about it. I mean, here's a character who's never once thought about reproductive rights. He's just, again, towing party line. He's part of the GOP intransigence. And so, his own self-knowledge, weirdly, in my mind, is dependent upon this moment, whether or not he can recognize that there are consequences to the way that he is voting and whether that matters to him. And if it doesn't matter to him, then he is one kind of person. And if it does, he's another. And the other kind of person that he is the one, of course, who has some hope for himself, right? I mean, how can he ever fully know himself if he can't, empathize with another human being? And so that to me is really where, we really start to press upon the central quandary of this book, which is, to what degree can we feel empathy for a character like Alex Wilson? And, his own ability to know himself is, at least in my mind, a little bit of a part of that answer.
Yes, the men in this book.
It is a comedy. Can we just remind everyone that this it sounds like I'm preaching here, but
it's just amazing the horrible things that they think about women. It is truly remarkable. Downing is, women's minds are always just mush, and
I mean, come on, it's nothing we haven't heard before.
Oh yeah,
it's not new.
It is. It was really wonderful.
It was a lot of fun to call it out. I'll just say that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's actually, I think one of the great successes of this book is, so it's a very political book. It is a cri de coeur. You are naming the names. You are calling people out, but you can do it because it's funny. You can do it because it's smartly written, and it's just such a pleasure to read it. It's more usual for people who want to go after politics to dive deep into genre somehow, especially like in science fiction. Feminists very often will write sci-fi. And there are many famous examples, from, over the people like Marge Piercy and
Sure.
L'Engle and all of these people.
Yeah.
It's less usual to have a successful satiric novel that really nails politics, I think. So bravo for you.
Thank you. That's so nice of you to say. I mean, I don't view the novel primarily as, a political statement. I mean, for me, these characters are very real. They're very human and they're very whole to me. But, just by nature of their circumstance, and in particular, Alex's situation and how he is kind of positioned in the book. I mean, he is just being faced with, a very real contemporary problem, which is the lack of our ability to know ourselves. And this, just in the way that taxidermy and, other kind of macabre elements were in vogue, in the Victorian era. Well, now, now he's got his constant Twitter and his, iPhone and his text messages and his emails that are constantly building up on him. My sister-in-law actually was working on the Hill while I was writing this novel. And so she would just tell me about the constant influx of information she had to manage. And so Alex's distraction is another piece of, his problem. The fact that he never really gives himself time to do this deep thinking that he needs to do. There's a moment as we move towards the end of the book when he feels himself about to weep and he whips out his phone. I mean, that's what he does to protect himself. So, that to me is like also another way that we can empathize with a character like this, because we recognize that in ourselves, don't we? I mean, this constant sense of being pulled away and distracted, and we're not allowed the kind of deep thinking that we should be doing. Maybe that's changing now that we're in a global pandemic. But in some ways, I don't know, maybe it's worse now that we're in the pandemic. There's more to be distracted by, but you know what I'm saying? The pace of our modern era, it is not always hospitable, right, for human understanding.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, would you talk a little bit about research? This book has, I would have this sense that there'd be one sentence, and I was like, yeah, that took about 10 days to get the research for for that one sentence. How much time did you spend? You have this. You seem to have this very seamless writing process. You said you did it in 6 weeks. Had you already done all the research? Did you just like Google things as you,
oh,
as
no.
you went along? Like, what did you,
how did you do this? A first draft is a first draft. No, I definitely spent a considerable amount of time making sure that I had the correct facts to support the story that I was writing. Research is always a dangerous thing when you're writing fiction, because it's so interesting. You just really lose yourself in, suddenly, you're reading about Victorian, methodologies for taxidermy for 3 hours. And then suddenly you like, no, I need to get back to writing, and so, I've actually found it to be useful to simply ask myself questions on like a notepad while I'm writing, like, you need to know this, you need to research this. And then I can kind of keep going. But I went to Leamington Spa, England, which was actually the best thing I could have done, because I lived in England for a year. I had a sense of, kind of the British sensibility, as much as an American who spends 1 year in England can. But so then I went back to Leamington Spa, and I got to sort of walk, the area where Titus Downing lived, and I got to see, the building where I imagined his shop to be, which is across from the All Saints Church, which is really there, and just to sort of smell the air and have a physical experience in that place. That was extremely useful to me. And then of course there were Aardvark videos, there were, days of learning about, taxidermy. I knew nothing about taxidermy before I started writing this novel. And so, that too requires some time, but that's time I enjoy. I don't think of it as like research per se, which is sort of a scientific word. I really approach it from the surrealist sense, which is you are kind of gathering an amalgam of different experiences. So, in order to write. So my experience of reading about taxidermy is the thing that I bring into the novel. It's not the language itself, but it's my reaction to it, if that makes sense. So that in that way, the information that I need to convey to create any kind of sense of accuracy about the time is rendered or sort of filtered through the lens of a human's experience with information, rather than just writing down rote information. Nothing turns me off more in fiction than like an info drop. It just, I mean, there's no kind of voice. There's nothing with character, so it has to belong to the character in some way, in order for me to feel like I want to read it. Otherwise, it's just like, why am I reading this? I mean, otherwise it just becomes, I don't know, too obvious. I break out of the dream of the narrative. Yeah.
Well, I think you did that so brilliantly with that little intro that you read, the very first part of the book. where you're summarizing, all of time,
Sure.
but in this way that is, well, I think I wrote you, who knew the pathetic fallacy could be hilarious? This whole idea that that rocks feel something, that there are human emotions attached to, the Devonian nerds, that it's the opposite of an info drop. I mean, it is, it's like the hilarious YouTube version of it, there's something very, it was a trick. It was such a trick that you pulled off there.
Thank
really.
you. Should we open to questions? What do you think? What time is it?
Are there more people who would like to ask questions?
Or do we have, okay, if we're not, then that's fine.
Guys.
For right now, and while we are hoping people ask us more questions, or comments on Aardvarks, perhaps, I would again mention that Gibson's Bookstore does have copies of the book available for sale and signed book plates. We are currently offering 99-cent shipping, because we got 99 problems, but shipping ain't one. So if anybody does have any questions, I think we've got about 10 or 15 more minutes.
Okay, great.
If anybody has any more questions that they want to throw into the chat, please do. Oh, I do see one here in our Q&A. Oh, what is your background, Jessica?
Mm-hmm. So that's a big question. Well, I live in Maine right now. I grew up in upstate New York. I'm not sure. Can we get more specific about my background? Like, what is it they would like to know?
It just says, what is your background? Let's talk specifically, I suppose, what led you to be a writer?
Yeah. Well, I was always a reader, I just, when I was a little kid, I just loved reading almost more than anything. My parents at night would have to put me to sleep with huge stacks of books. It's kind of how I was able to go to sleep at night. And so, I didn't really ever think of myself as a writer. I just knew that I was a person who really loved to read. And then when I went to college, I saw that you could take a course in poetry writing and thought, wow, that's kind of amazing. I never really knew that you could do that for credit. And then suddenly I was in a writing workshop, and it was just from that point on, I knew that I was addicted to this, My first writing workshop in fiction was actually at the University of Manchester. That year in England that I spent was my junior year abroad in Manchester. And I was working with Michael Schmidt and Richard Francis, two novelists in England who were incredibly tough. They really don't care about your feelings in England. And so I submitted a story, and it's a sort of a famous family anecdote, but when I went to the workshop, I sort of expected, a little bit of back patting. There's this sense, I think, in the American classroom that just for doing something, you should get praise for it, just for trying, But I sat down in the class, and, he opened up my story, and he said, right, there are many problems with this story. I'm going to begin with the first 12, and he read a list of all the things that I'd done wrong. So I went back to my room and felt just gutted. I mean, I couldn't believe what had just happened, But it was a big moment. I realized from that moment, okay, this is number one, a hard thing to do, to be a writer, and number two, either you're going to get better or you're going to quit. And so, I think for those of us who are joining us who are writers, I mean, coming to that moment where you recognize how hard this is. I think all of us can bring our own story, right, about that moment when you realize how much work this is. So I would just say that my, my evolution, or, where I kind of come from as a writer, is just really from a passion for reading, but also a recognition that I am a person who is not afraid of the work. In fact, I often feel less alone than ever when I'm working on a story and I'm deep in a story. I don't think about my own condition at all. And it's such a dreamy place to be. And it's always where I want to be. I've also learned over the years that I prefer to write longer narratives than short stories. I wrote short stories for a while. I wrote poems for a while. There's another famous story about Jess Anthony as a young secretary living in New York City. Right when the internet was starting to happen, there was a contest advertising, like, write a poem, win $10,000 on yahoo.com. Remember like when everyone used Yahoo? Yeah. So it was my lunch hour. I looked at the poems. It was like called the International Library of Poetry, and they were giving out huge amounts of money, for these poems. And they were all poems that had to do with a relative and like a natural element of some kind, like my grandmother in the rain type poem. So I wrote a poem. It's a really cynical thing to do, but I just wrote a poem. And I got a phone call 3 months later, and they said, "You've won the grand prize. You've won $10,000. So I use that to actually get my butt to an MFA program in fiction. And the poets will never forgive me for this. They say it's absolutely unforgivable that you funded your MFA in fiction by winning $10,000 by writing a poem on Yahoo.com. But it's true that actually happens. I don't know what to say. What can I say? It's like in some ways it's a ridiculous story, but.
You do that seems to be the beginning of your amazing journey through finding really unusual grants and ways to support yourself as a writer. And I did promise people on Facebook that
Sure.
you would talk a little bit about the really interesting grants that you have come up with. So have at it.
Oh, thanks. Well, I've always had to work. I've never, I count myself lucky when I say this, that, my parents never paid my way. I mean, they were incredibly generous people, and they definitely supported me in more ways than one. But, I know families that really just write their kids checks every month, and that was definitely not my scenario. I mean, there were some really tight months there. And so I always needed to work. And so I started out actually teaching English as a second language. And when I went to Poland to do this for the first time, I realized that this actually might be an interesting way to practice, fiction. And also it was an opportunity to kind of see a little bit of the world and to do some traveling. Because, how do you afford to travel, if you don't have the money to do so? You've got to have a job. So I taught English for a while. I taught English as a second language, and it was a great experience. I went back to Prague, and I lived in Prague for a year teaching Czech businessmen, in northern Bohemia English, which was its own experience. And then I would live in Prague, and it was great. I got a ton of writing done. I wasn't in an MFA. I didn't even really have any sense of the MFA in my mind. I just like to write stories. And so yeah, I mean, I guess I've always kind of tried to find an opportunity to have an experience, through a grant or a residency, where it's not just, oh, I'm applying something that's going to give me money, but I'm applying for something that's actually going to take me somewhere or teach me something new about the world or reveal something about my work that needs to be revealed to me. And it's that strategy has been the way that I've been able to secure, I would say, the most success seeking out grants and other kind of assistance as a writer. So it's like McSweeney's a while ago offered the Amanda Davis Highwire Fiction Award. I think they may still offer it, but it was pretty great. That was way back in 2004, and they were advertising applications for it was a $5,000 award for a woman writer under 30 who had had a number of really bad jobs, but who also had half of a novel. And it was like they were talking to me. It was like I'd had 26 jobs up to that point. I'd been a masseuse. I had been a secretary. I had worked in a convenience store in Alaska. I mean, I had this huge roster of jobs that I could talk about. And then I submitted the first half of my first novel to them, The Convalescent, which they then accepted, and I got the prize, which was extraordinary. But next year I have a residency at the estate of George Washington in Mount Vernon, which is not a fancy official writing residency at all. It's a residency where you go and you stay for a month and you get to research George Washington. So I think in some ways, as you're starting out as a writer, you think that you need to be getting the Yaddo experience, getting the McDowell experience. And, and I went to McDowell. It was a really amazing place and so generous of them, what they do for artists and writers. But I guess I would just urge folks to kind of look beyond the kind of traditional, prestigious, writing residencies and communities, because it's a big world out there, and there are all kinds of ways to make time for yourself and to give yourself some funding to do this. Two websites that I would recommend checking out if you're into this, folks. One specifies specifically, it's an international residency. So when this pandemic is over and we can all return to travel, hopefully sooner than later, this website is called resartist.org. So that's RESARTIS.org. Residency artists, so resartist.org. And the other is the Alliance for Artist Communities, which is just the big website that has every single writing residency listed on there. And so, across the US, you can find all kinds of crazy ways to make time for your fiction.
That is wonderful. How much time do we have, Elizabeth?
I think we have time for you to ask one more question.
I would like to know what you read.
Gosh, I mean, it just depends on where I am with my writing. If I am writing a draft, I do not read any fiction. I'm a very impressionable writer, and so I will find myself parroting whatever I'm reading, which is a really awful thing. No, I do. I mean, and then it's just, I really need to be in my own head as a fiction writer. So I allow myself, all the nonfiction I want when I'm writing a novel, but the fiction can be the only fiction that I'm writing. But, when I'm sort of between books, or, I'm doing essays or some other genre, then, really I will go back to fiction. Right now I've been reading some John Fowles, which I'm just sort of rediscovering, like The Magus, French Lieutenant's Wife. I
was thinking about the French Lieutenant's Woman
woman. Thank you. Sorry, French Lieutenant's Woman.
But it made me, if that book had been funny, it would have been kind of like your book.
Oh. I've really been interested recently in sort of, the fiction that was emerging through the 50s, 60s, 70s. There's something quite marvelous about this period that I'm just now really discovering. I just finished teaching a course on women writers of the 1950s, which was so interesting.
Oh, who did you cover?
Fantastic. We covered, Flannery O'Connor, of course, Patricia Highsmith, Carson McCullers, Gwendolyn Brooks, really marvelous African-American playwright Alice Childress, who nobody knows and everyone should know. She's brilliant. We read the play Trouble in Mind, which is just so funny and so good. We did Patricia Highsmith and Sylvia Plath, and so it was it was a wild ride in a lot of ways. And we also did some Shirley Jackson, of course, which was great, a lot of fun.
We just did that, we did Haunting of Hill House in our book club
that's October. Great. Yeah. So, I don't know. I think there's something about this period, the 50s, 60s, 70s, that's interesting. I don't know. There's something curious going on in that moment, that kind of transitory moment that feels, it feels important for right now, because we're also going through something hugely transformative in this country, not only with the pandemic, but also politically. And so I'm curious to see how writers have sort of responded through the 60s. In fiction, and this means wandering into some absurd territory, like, into the kind of the Vonnegut and the Bartholomew and the what have you. But really, I've been very interested in sort of seeing how the women writers have been reacting to that transformation. So I don't know where this is going to take me, but that's kind of the work I've been focused on right now. Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. Well,
does anybody have a question before we say goodbye?
Last call. So this has been really great. I haven't finished the book. I'm halfway through, and I have been listening to the audiobook. If somebody mentioned in the chat earlier that the audiobook was amazing, and I can confirm. I take it on my walks with me, and my neighbors think I'm crazy now because I laugh out loud. and they're like, what is this? They don't see my headphones underneath my hair. And the audiobook is just hilarious. The narrator does a really great job. And I'm really a little bit afraid of where this book is going to go, because
be afraid. Definitely be afraid.
It gets and bigger, and you're like, what is gonna happen next? But he kind of deserves it. But it's ridiculous, and I'm very much enjoying it. Camille says she's read it twice, and it's actually
I did 3 times.
3 times. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. To everybody at home, again, our events program is sustained by book sales. If you would like to support the bookstore in another way, you can go to gibsonsbookstore.com/donation and, I don't know, chuck a buck towards us, or please tell your friends how much you enjoyed this program. We are recording tonight, so we will be sending the link out after we have edited it and posted it online. So tell your friends that you enjoyed this program, have them watch it, get eyeballs on this book, because it did come out at the worst time. So please tell your friends about this book.
Share it.
Thank you so much.
So,
Gibson's, yay!
From Gibson's Bookstore Remote Events Program, from all of us to you, everybody, have a great night. Bye.
Good night. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you both.